It is good to see all of you on this very last Shabbat of 2022, getting ourselves ready for 2023. We're going to look at a moment of dramatic climax within our story today. It is really better than any soap opera that you can get on TV. This is good stuff, good material that we have here. And we're going to look at it from a perspective that I don't usually frame it in this way, but I want us to think about what this section means for us from a spiritual perspective. And that's not to say that we don't talk about spirituality here. We talk about spirituality a lot. But I'm often reluctant to frame something in terms of a spiritual perspective because, first of all, that means something different to many different people, right? How we see spirituality, how we look at something spiritually may be different. And I think it's kind of been overused in today's world. And so we don't always come back to the traditional understandings of what we have in our Torah. And I would argue that it's obviously very spiritual, right? Everything that we read about here has a huge spiritual component to it, but it's just not something that we think about in that way. So let's turn in Parashat Vayigash to page 276 in the red Chumashim. We began this parasha actually with the speech of Judah. We spoke a little bit about this, Rabbi Ern and I, in our podcast, about what it means to say sorry and what it means to apologize and come to that place. But I actually want to look at Joseph's reaction to this and try to understand what it means and what Joseph is trying to do here with his brothers and for his brothers. Verse 3 on page 276, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. They were speechless, right? They were literally speechless. They couldn't understand. They couldn't comprehend this moment, right? Of they're looking at Pharaoh's number 2 here, and all of a sudden, now they see their brother Joseph. So what does Joseph then do in response to this speechlessness? Then Joseph says to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years, and there has been a famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come, in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth, and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance." Verse 8, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And God has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, ruler over the whole land of Egypt." All right. So what is it that Joseph is trying to do here? And what's the spiritual message? What's the spiritual learning that we can get from this interaction that we have between Joseph and his brothers? Marge. Beautiful. First of all, I love what you said, and I'm going to quote something else in just a second. But if we look at what we think leads to what we feel, right? Then what he's doing here is changing the way that his brothers are thinking to change perhaps the way that we feel, right? And Rabbi Sachs, in his book on studies in spirituality, actually talks about this very thing, and he quotes the Tanya, and it says specifically, if we change the way we think, we change the way we feel. Right? So, awesome, great. What else?
That brings up another question. If Joseph was the second in command, why did he not find out about how his father was doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole subtext here. I'm just repeating it so that people at home can hear. There's a whole subtext here about the story of Joseph looking into his father, right? If Joseph was truly so powerful, why didn't he find out earlier? Why didn't he let his father know earlier? Right? There's all of these different questions that come about, and there aren't necessarily good answers to it. There aren't necessarily good answers to it. Clearly, Joseph is concerned about his father now in all of this. First thing he asks, is my father well? And it leads then to the great reconciliation of the entire family in next week's Parsha, right, as we do all of that. But it is a little troubling. It is a little troubling that he had all this power. He could have sent people, he could have brought them there, he could have done all sorts of different things, and he chose not to. He chose not to. So what else? What do we learn about this from a spiritual perspective?
He puts God into the equation several times in this paragraph.
Yeah.
He's trying to be a role model and say, this is our religion, this is what we believe in.
Oh, I like that. I like that. He definitely brings God into the equation here. And Judy, what you're saying is perhaps he's trying to be a role model here for his brothers, right? To remind them of who they were, who they are, their connection to God, all of those sorts of things. I mean, a lot of this, the rabbis ask, why does it, they don't like anything that's extraneous. So it says, I am your brother, he whom you sold into Egypt. So like that little piece, is it that they don't remember that they sold him into Egypt? Some rabbis say that he looked so different that they didn't believe that it could actually be Joseph until he said, I'm the one you sold into Egypt. Oh, well, that showed that he was truly Joseph, because who else would have known that? No imposter would have known that. He may be trying to be a role model here, of trying to say, look, God had something to do with all of this. Don't forget that. Anybody else? So it's interesting, and I want to come back, and Marge, it doesn't surprise me that you're the one who kind of led into this, right? I want to come back to this idea. We talk about psychological reframing a lot, right? Certainly one of the most famous proponents of this would be Viktor Frankl in his Search for Meaning, right? Of what it means to be in a concentration camp, to be in the midst of the Holocaust and still come out of it, right? He talked a lot about psychological reframing, of how we take a situation, we understand the things that we can't control about the situation, we understand the things that we can control about the situation, which very often is our own perspective and our own response to that situation. And by reframing it, it puts us in a different place. It puts us in a different place. And so this idea of psychological reframing leads to all sorts of different modalities of psychotherapy, whether it be cognitive behavioral therapy, all sorts of things in terms of reframing what we do, what we think in a way that gets us to a healthier place. But I'm going to argue that I think what we're doing here is a spiritual reframing as well as a psychological reframing. And in doing so, it not only deals with the emotions, but it deals with the issues of the heart as well. I mean, I guess the question is, why were the brothers speechless? Right? You could argue they were speechless because they were in shock. You could argue that they were speechless because they were surprised by this. You could argue they were speechless because they were afraid, right? That maybe, now all of a sudden, here's this person of power. And we see that fear coming in later on, right? We see it later on. But you could also argue, as many of the rabbis do, many of the commentators actually say they were speechless out of shame. They were speechless out of shame. That the weight of what they did and the reality of what they did finally came back to a moment where they couldn't avoid it. They couldn't get away from it. They couldn't, lie about it to their father. They couldn't, all of these sorts of things that they were using, frankly, as coping mechanisms, right, for what it is that they did to make themselves feel better about it. Oh, sure, we'll just, we'll sell him off to slavery. We'll put him in there, but we're not going to kill him. We'll just leave him in a ditch. Right? All of these things were sort of coping mechanisms for the immensity of what it is that they were trying to do here. It's understandable that there's shame that goes along with that. And shame is one of those emotions that really, as I understand it, crosses this boundary between emotional and spiritual, right? It crosses the boundary in an interesting way. A lot of our emotions, you can say, maybe they have a spiritual component, but okay, anger, certainly you could argue, it can have a spiritual component to it. Fear, maybe. But shame is something that affects us not only intellectually, but it affects the whole of who we are. And that, to me, goes into the realm of spiritual. And so for Joseph here, he wanted to try and address that. He wanted to try and move past that because, as we see here, it stops everything, right? It doesn't allow for life to continue when you're so weighed down with the weight of shame, the shame of something that we've done, shame of something that has happened. We're so weighed down with it, it doesn't allow us to move forward. And we see that. They couldn't even speak. They couldn't move forward. And so how does Joseph try to deal with the shame aspect of it? And I don't know if it's a good solution or not a good solution. We can discuss that. But what's his response here?
Well, I think, first of all, he doesn't gloss over what they did. He reframes it,
Mm-hmm.
which is a lot different than what he told when he was in prison, the cupbearer, like, I was kidnapped, and he goes through this whole thing. Here says, you did intend to harm me when it came up, and so he does reframe it in their mind. And over time, I think, we all have narratives in our lives, and they all do change over time. So I think he's really looking here at I guess the top list. What do they want? What do they need to do? They're in the midst of a famine. He already knows that it's going to be 7 years because of his dreams. They're 2 years in. Things aren't really getting better.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's going to try to reunite everybody, but he doesn't ever really say, I forgive you. I think he doesn't come out, I don't think, or maybe he does actually, somewhere. Anyway, he says, all right, this happened, it was really bad, let's turn it around, and the only way we're going to get through this is if we come down here and we can help you out with food, and then they become these great landholders, and it sort of has this seemingly happy ending at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, Bob.
If Joseph had any bitterness, he decided that it wouldn't serve any purpose to verbalize it. And
Interesting,
he said,
yeah.
And he said, he thought, well, the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say it's all for the best, God's will, things are going to work out. And he saw the bigger picture, and he wanted to reconcile with his brothers.
So you said actually a bunch of things that are very, very important. Number one is if Joseph had any bitterness, he made a choice, right, not to go down that direction, right? Number two, he made a decision that he wanted to say, okay, look, whatever happened, it's for the best. Let's move on. It worked out okay. I'm going to get back to that in a second. And look, I think what's going on here in a number of different ways, right, is Joseph is making a critical decision here as to how he wants to move forward. And is he going to be in the blame game, so to speak, or is he going to say, look, for myself and for them, I'm going to find a way to move past this? And this is his attempt, I think, at that. We can decide in a moment whether it was a good attempt or not a good attempt, but this is his attempt.
I think also in going through this, we see this total role reversal where, now he's in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And he's telling them what to do. Like, go to get your father. And I love the part where he says, and don't be quarrelsome along the way.
Right.
So
So,
we see him taking that charge at this point.
so Joseph definitely taking charge here, although one could argue that part of the problem from the earlier part of the story was that he was taking charge in a lot of different ways also. But this comes across, obviously, in a different way. Hetty.
I see it as very a deeply religious statement, and also saying that the God you believe in is God. I believe in.
Yeah.
We are the same religion, we're the same people, and our actions are out of our control at times, and you did what you were supposed to do.
Yeah, so two parts of what Hetty said I think are equally important. The first is, and it goes back I think a little bit to what you were saying too, Judy, is my God is your God. Like we come from the same people. It's a way to bring them back together again after all of this separation. And the second thing is, there are actions, there are things that happen in this world that are out of our control, and the question though that I struggle with in terms of that though, Hetty, is these particular actions were in their control, right? They were in their control. And what Joseph is doing here is reframing it by saying, actually, this was God's plan. So what's that message? Because that's the piece I want to kind of get to. Like, these were actions and decisions that the brothers made that were clearly in their control. And now Joseph is saying, this is God's plan. What's the message? It appears to be that he forgives them. Yeah, I think you could argue that. It's not 100%, because you might be able to still say that and not forgive them. But I think yes, certainly he's moved on from it, whether he forgives them or not, but he's moved on. Yeah, Marge?
Well, I think there's forgiveness and acceptance, and maybe what he's done is accept that this happened because God had a different plan. And whether God had that plan before it all happened, or when it all happened, we don't know.
So there's an acceptance, Marge is saying, and that with God's larger plan here, it gives us something to sort of lean back on and to say, look, this is the way it was supposed to go. It happened the way that it's supposed to go. Anybody else? Yeah, Jack.
I actually come away from this story not feeling very good about Joseph at all.
Okay.
What he should have done is when he found out his father was still alive, he should have gone right at that point instead of having this whole story going back and forth. What he should have done is say, I'm your brother Joseph. At that point, he should have done it and brought his father back. Because what he did was, he was very disrespectful to his father. What he did was, he caused his father more grief. Because he comes back there, and then wants to bring back Benjamin, he could have done that the first time.
Right.
So I come back from this thing saying, another example of lousy family dynamics, and also that I just don't believe Joseph.
So it's interesting. There's parts to me that I definitely agree with what you're saying. Just to repeat, what Jack was saying is, first of all, the dysfunctionality of the family is so deep, and it has been for a while, right? It's one generation after the next. There's no doubt about that. But Jack really struggles with Joseph, and the fact that the way Joseph does this creates an additional hardship for Jacob, for his father. And that he's really not thinking about his father and respecting his father. He's so caught up in my dynamics with my brothers that, this almost seems like an afterthought. Oh yeah, is my father okay? At the end of all of this, when he could have found out earlier, he could have dealt with it earlier. So look, I want to come to a conclusion on this conversation just by arguing. I think Joseph is at an inflection point. He's at a choice. And it's a choice that we all come to when dealing with the reality of a situation that isn't the way that we want it to be. Right? Whatever that situation may be, whether it's at work, whether it's with family, we are often faced with that reality. Here is a situation, it is some degree out of our control. Maybe it's even in our control, but because of certain realities, it is not the way we want it to be. We have a choice to make at some point in time. And I think the choice that Joseph is making here, whether he forgives or doesn't forgive, I don't know. But clearly what we can say here is Joseph has decided it is time to move past this. It is time to let it go. He may not forgive, he may not have forgotten, but he, for his own sake, and perhaps for the sake of the brothers, he says, okay, look, I'm going to acknowledge what happened. I'm your brother Joseph. Yeah, you sold me into slavery. Now, whether we argue the theological route, which a lot of our rabbis do, to say this was God's plan all along and everything happened the way God wanted it to, okay. But even if we take that theological argument out for a second, right, and say, wait a second, this was the choice of the brothers. Joseph is saying to them, you know what? In spite of everything that happened, I'm okay. Let's move on. And that's a very profound spiritual moment and a very difficult one to get to. To be able to say for ourselves, I've been hurt, but you know what? I'm okay, and let's move on, is an incredibly important and profound moment. And to me, I think that's what's going on here. And the message behind this, the modeling behind this, is really important. And it doesn't solve all the problems. We see this in the next chapter, right? They're worried that, okay, yeah, and everything's better, and the brothers now get worried that Joseph's going to kill them and does this whole back thing with Jacob and all of that. Like, it doesn't take away all the problems. But at some point in time, Joseph was the only person in this story who had the power to be able to say, let's move on. Because the brothers didn't know. The brothers didn't know. I have no doubt if the brothers knew that this was Joseph, this story would have been very different in terms of how the brothers approached and what happened. And, you know, they still may have apologized. They may not have. Who knows? But Joseph was the only one who had the power in that situation to make a change. He recognized it, and he said, I'm going to make this change. And I'm going to say, I'm okay. To me, that's what I hear when he says that this wasn't God's plan. Whether he believes that this was exactly the way God intended it to be, no. But I hear him saying, God intended me to be okay, and I am. I am. I've gotten to a point where I'm okay. As we read through the end of this, and I agree with Jack, I struggle with Joseph. I think that Joseph, more than many of our the figures in Genesis, Joseph goes through a huge growth curve and backslides sometimes, right? It's a very human growth curve, right? He starts this immature, cocky, young kid, and he winds up going through a lot and being in jail and understanding how to deal with people and understanding how to deal with power and all of these sorts of things. Eventually, he gets to this place where at the end he's going to have a reunion, but it's a difficult journey. It's a difficult journey, and this is a crucial piece. Without this moment here of him finally saying, I'm not going to play games anymore, I'm not hiding cups anymore, I'm not doing all those things anymore, I'm going to say, okay, it's done. It's done. I'm moving forward. It's a powerful moment. Any last comments before we actually go in and read this? All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.